The diner hummed with the familiar dullness of early morning. The neon sign outside buzzed, casting flickering red light across the mostly empty parking lot. Beyond it, the highway stretched into nothingness, just a long, dark ribbon of road leading to places no one cared to go at this hour. Inside, the fluorescent lights bathed everything in an artificial glow, washing the walls in a sickly yellow. The air smelled of burnt coffee and fryer grease, the scent clinging to the cracked vinyl booths and the scuffed black and white tiles. The faint sound of a radio played from the back, barely a whisper beneath the steady drone of the kitchen's ventilation. The worker behind the counter, just another person in another late-night shift, moved through the routine with mechanical precision. Wipe down the counter, refill the napkin dispensers, check the coffee pot, glance up at the clock. 3 Uhr nachts. It felt like it had been 3 a.m. for hours. A trucker sat hunched over his coffee at the counter, his heavy frame sagging beneath the weight of exhaustion. His hands, rough and calloused, cradled the mug without drinking. Every so often, he stirred the liquid with a spoon, the gentle clink of metal against ceramic the only sign of movement. His eyes were fixed on something distant, something far beyond the walls of the diner. In a booth near the window, a young couple sat close together, their faces pale under the harsh lighting. Their food remained untouched, the plates sweating against the plastic tabletop. The woman's lips moved soundlessly, speaking to the man across from her, but no words reached the air. His fingers traced slow circles against the side of his glass, condensation pooling beneath it. In the farthest corner, a man in a weathered coat sat with his back against the wall. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but the dull gleam of his eyes was visible when the light hit just right. He had been there when the shift started. He never ordered, never moved, just sat there watching. The worker poured another cup of coffee, though they couldn't recall whose order it was meant for. The motion had become instinctive. The diner ran on muscle memory, plates clinking, grease sizzling, the faint creak of the swinging kitchen door. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling against the glass. The neon sign flickered again. The trucker stirred his coffee. The woman at the booth whispered. The man in the corner sat unmoving. The worker wiped down the counter again. The rag left streaks across the laminate, faint smudges reflecting the fluorescent glow. They reached for the napkin dispenser, adjusting its placement, though it was already where it needed to be. The clock on the wall loomed above them, round and simple, the second hand ticking its slow, steady circle. 3 Uhr nachts. Again, something shifted at the edge of perception. A feeling, nothing more. The air seemed heavier, the diner a fraction quieter. The sound of the trucker stirring his coffee had not stopped. Had it ever stopped? The couple in the booth remained frozen in their quiet conversation, the movements of their mouths repeating in an identical rhythm. The worker stepped back from the counter. A faint ringing had settled in their ears, like the distant echo of a forgotten sound. The hum of the lights, the drone of the radio, the soft patter of rain against the window, all of it seemed distant, muffled. They looked at the clock again. Still 3 a.m. It had to be wrong. The shift had been dragging, but not that much. They reached for their phone in their pocket, the cold glass of the screen familiar beneath their fingertips. The glow of the screen flickered to life. 3 Uhr nachts. The trucker stirred his coffee. The couple whispered. The man in the corner stared. The worker set the phone down, heartbeat quickening. The minutes should have passed. They always passed. Somewhere in the kitchen, the radio crackled. The music had stopped, leaving only static. The diner hummed, unchanged. The customers sat as they always had. The smell of burnt coffee and grease clung to the air. The worker turned, looking toward the glass door. Beyond it, the highway stretched into the dark. The neon light from the sign bathed the pavement in red. The wind picked up. The trucker stirred his coffee. 3 Uhr nachts. The diner felt heavier now, like the air itself had thickened into something just shy of solid. It pressed in, subtle at first, like an unseen weight settling onto the worker's shoulders. The low hum of the fluorescent lights droned on, blending with the faint crackle of the radio in the back. The smell of coffee and fryer grease clung to the air, unchanged, unmoving. The worker glanced up at the clock. 3 Uhr nachts. Again, the same numbers, the same position of the hands. A mistake, maybe? They must have misread it the first time. They reached for their phone, flipping it over with quick fingers. The blue light of the screen cut through the dimness, casting cold illumination onto the counter. The numbers stared back at them, unwavering. 3 Uhr nachts. Their pulse thumped heavier, an off-rhythm beat beneath their skin. It had been hours, hadn't it? A creeping sensation prickled at the base of their spine. Something was wrong. They fumbled into their pocket for their watch, pressing the small side button. The glow of its numbers flickered on, dim and unwavering. 3 Uhr nachts. It didn't make sense. The worker's breath came slower now, drawn out in careful, measured pulls. The diner hadn't changed. Same lights, same hum, same weak flicker of a neon sign outside. But something about it felt stuck, like a photograph held in place, the world suspended in an unmoving frame. They turned their attention to the counter. The trucker sat just as before, his large hands wrapped around the ceramic coffee mug. His spoon swirled slow, even circles through the liquid. The coffee never rippled. The couple near the window remained locked in conversation, but their words never reached the air. The woman's lips formed silent shapes, over and over, a repetition of something unseen. Her hand rested lightly on the table, fingers tracing absent-minded circles on the damp surface near her untouched water glass. The man across from her had barely moved. His hand hovered near his fork, fingers just shy of touching the metal. But he never actually grabbed it. At the far end of the diner, the man in the weathered coat sat as still as ever. His head remained slightly bowed, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But his eyes, dim, reflective pinpoints in the dull lighting, remained fixed exactly where they had been before. No one had moved. No one had changed. The worker let the phone slip from their fingers, its faint glow dimming against the counter. Their hands felt clammy, their heartbeat thick in their throat. They turned toward the window. Beyond the glass, the parking lot stretched into the dark, slick with the reflection of neon light. The sky above was an endless void, no stars, no passing headlights, just blackness. The road, usually alive with distant movement, was empty. Then movement, not outside, inside. Their breath hitched as they caught it, not in the diner itself, not in the booths or the aisles, but in the reflection. Their own reflection. It moved a second too late. Not a big delay, just a flicker, the smallest hesitation between action and imitation, like a film reel missing a frame. A cold pressure wrapped itself around their chest, tightening. The reflection's head tilted. The worker had not tilted theirs. The trucker stirred his coffee. The woman traced the rim of her glass. The man hovered over his fork. The man in the corner did nothing, and their reflection smiled. The worker did not. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound that should have been normal, should have blended into the background. But now it felt sharp, a blade against silence. The diner's hum seemed louder, the white noise stretching, warping at the edges. Then the radio crackled. The static shifted once, twice before settling into something that almost resembled breathing, or whispering, or something in between. The worker took a step back. Their foot slid against something soft, damp. The rag, fallen from their hand, limp on the linoleum. No one reacted. No one moved. The clock on the wall loomed above them, silent and still. 3 Uhr nachts. The reflection had stopped smiling, but its head was still tilted, and its eyes were still watching. The diner held its breath. The workers stood frozen behind the counter, pulse thrumming in their ears, a steady beat against the eerie silence. The reflection in the window still had its head tilted, just slightly, just wrong, but they didn't dare look at it again. They couldn't. Instead, they turned their attention back to the room. Nothing had changed, yet everything had changed. The trucker at the counter was still hunched over his coffee, fingers wrapped tightly around the ceramic mug. But his stirring had finally stopped. The spoon sat still in the liquid, the surface undisturbed, perfectly smooth. His other hand rested stiffly on the counter, fingers splayed, pressing into the laminate as if anchoring him in place. Then, too slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes, dull and glassy, locked onto something unseen beyond the worker, past them, through them. His mouth, which had been moving in quiet, muttering moments ago, had gone slack, lips parted as though caught mid-sentence. A breathless, frozen expression, like a statue, caught between movements. The couple in the booth had stopped too. Their mouths no longer moved in conversation, but their bodies remained locked in position, halfway through their last action. The woman's fingers still rested on the damp surface of the table, but now they were digging in, indenting into the condensation pooling beneath them. The man across from her still hadn't picked up his fork, but his hand was no longer hovering. It was clenched into a tight fist, knuckles stretched white. And then there was the man in the coat. He had not moved at all. He remained slumped in the farthest corner, the brim of his hat still hiding most of his face. But something about the shape of his body seemed off now, the shadows falling against him differently than before. The faint gleam of his eyes beneath the brim no longer blinked. A chill skittered up the worker's spine, lodging itself in the base of their skull. Then movement. The front door swung open. The air should have shifted, the scent of damp pavement or the crisp bite of early morning slipping in from outside. But nothing changed. No rush of air, no shift in temperature. And worst of all, no bell. The worker's stomach twisted, dread unfurling from deep inside. The bell above the door always rang. Always. The sound was hardwired into them, part of the natural rhythm of the diner's quiet routine. The metal should have chimed with the subtle jingle of movement, but this time, there was only silence. A figure stepped inside. Their presence was immediately wrong. It wasn't that they looked unnatural, not at first. The shape was human, dressed in muted, nondescript clothing, neither too casual nor too formal. But their movement was off, too fluid, too smooth, as if they were gliding instead of walking. Their footsteps made no sound. The worker felt their breath stutter, catching in their chest. Every instinct in them screamed to turn away, to not look, but the figure was already standing near the counter, waiting. The fluorescent lights above flickered. The trucker had not blinked. The couple in the booth still sat in eerie, stiff stillness. The figure at the counter smiled. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't anything. Just a stretching of lips, too slow, too careful, revealing perfect colorless teeth. Their head tilted just slightly, mimicking the reflection from before. Their hands rested on the counter, palms down, fingers splayed too widely apart, pressing against the surface in an unnatural, practiced pose. The workers' hands clenched involuntarily. They could feel the sweat on their palms now, slick and cold. Their bodies screamed move, but they couldn't. The trucker inhaled. The sound came too late, like someone remembering they were supposed to breathe. His chest expanded in an unnatural, jerking motion, as if it were the first breath he had taken in hours. His hands didn't move from their place on the counter, and yet his head snapped toward the worker in one sharp motion. The couple at the booth followed. They did not turn naturally. Their heads swiveled at the same time, too synchronized, their unblinking eyes settling directly onto the worker. The man in the coat remained still, but now his mouth had opened. The worker took a shaky step back. Something had shifted in the diner's layout. The air felt too thick, the walls closer together, pressing in like something unseen was breathing in time with them. They turned toward the door. The open door should have shown the parking lot, the dark stretch of highway beyond, the weak neon glow reflecting against the pavement. Instead, there was nothing, a black expanse, stretching into nothingness, swallowing the space beyond the threshold. The diner had separated itself from the world outside. The workers' heartbeat pounded. They moved toward the door, each step heavier, as if wading through unseen resistance. They reached out, fingers brushing against the frame. The door slammed shut. The walls shuddered. The trucker grinned. The worker stumbled backward, pulse hammering in their ears. They turned toward the windows, desperate, hands pressing against the glass. But where there should have been a reflection of the diner's interior, there was only darkness. No neon glow, no streetlights, just black. The lights above flickered again. The worker turned, breath coming in ragged, uneven bursts. The trucker had pushed his coffee cup aside, his fingers now tapping against the counter, a steady, deliberate rhythm. The woman in the booth had placed her hands flat on the table, fingers twitching in unison. The man across from her gripped his fork now, holding it so tight that his knuckles bulged, skin stretched taut. And the man in the coat, his mouth was open wider now. The sound started low, a whisper of static, a fractured hum curling out from between his lips. The sound of something beneath words, something forming, pulling together, stretching against the edges of meaning. The worker's breath came in shallow bursts, chest rising and falling too quickly. The walls of the diner felt closer than before, the air too thick, too warm, pressing in like the inside of a clenched fist. The customers hadn't moved. Not really. They had changed, but they hadn't moved. The trucker's hand still drummed its slow, deliberate rhythm against the counter, his fingers hitting the laminate with the precision of a ticking clock. The woman in the booth had gone rigid, her fingers stretched unnaturally flat against the table's surface, as if trying to push through it. The man across from her still clutched his fork, but now his fingers twitched, spasming in tiny, sharp movements that sent tremors up his wrist. And the man in the coat, his mouth was still open, wider now, the static sound pulsing out in uneven bursts, growing louder with each passing second. The figure at the counter had not stopped smiling. The worker's heartbeat pounded, a wild drum against their ribs. Their bodies screamed to do something, to break the frozen nightmare of the room, to snap these people, these things, out of whatever trance held them in place. They lurched forward, grabbing the trucker's shoulder with both hands. The fabric was stiff beneath their grip, too thick, like old leather left in the sun too long. They shook him, fingers pressing into the solid mass of his arm, trying to force movement to make him react. He did, but not naturally. His entire body jerked back violently, as if pulled by invisible strings. His head snapped backward, eyes rolling toward the ceiling in two glassy, empty orbs. His lips parted, but no sound came out, just a deep, suffocating silence. Then, just as suddenly, he snapped forward again, back into his stiff, mannequin-like posture. His fingers resumed their tapping against the counter, the rhythm unchanged, as if nothing had happened. The workers stumbled away, a sharp noise of panic catching in their throat. Their hands were shaking now, fingers tingling as if something had pressed back against them when they had touched him. The air shifted. A scraping sound echoed through the diner, a slow, deliberate creak of something twisting too far. The worker turned, pulse hammering behind their eyes. The woman in the booth was moving, if it could even be called movement. Her head had started to turn, but it didn't stop where it should have. Her chin tilted over her shoulder, then further, the motion slow and unnatural, stretching her neck to an impossible angle. The wet pop of vertebrae splitting apart rang out in the silence, and her body remained completely still, only her head twisting further and further, until her unblinking eyes were facing directly backward. Then came the words. They didn't come from her mouth. They came from everywhere. The walls absorbed the sound, vibrating softly as the voice curled through the air like a whisper slipping beneath the skin. The words were wrong. The syllables fractured, broken at odd intervals. The worker staggered away, their back colliding with the counter. Their breath was sharp now, like knives scraping against their lungs. The neon light outside flickered violently, casting brief bursts of red across the diner's interior. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. The worker turned, hands fumbling against the wall, searching, desperate, for something tangible, something that still obeyed the rules of the world they knew. Their fingers found the light switch, cold plastic beneath their palm. They didn't think. They flipped it off. Everything vanished. For a moment, there was only darkness. The deep, suffocating black of an empty void, stretching in all directions. The worker felt weightless, disoriented, as if they had stepped out of existence itself. Then, they flipped the switch back on. The diner returned, but the world outside was gone. The highway had disappeared, the faint glow of streetlights swallowed into nothing. The neon sign still flickered above the entrance, but its reflection no longer stretched across pavement, because there was no pavement left. Beyond the diner's glass windows, there was only an endless desert, a vast, empty wasteland of cracked, sun-bleached earth, stretching forever beneath a sky that held no stars, no moon, no anything. The horizon blurred into the color of dust, shifting unnaturally, like something not meant to be seen. The worker pressed their hands against the glass, their own reflection staring back at them, distorted and wrong. Their breath fogged the surface, but it didn't fade. The mist clung to the glass in unnatural shapes, shifting, curling into something that almost looked like fingers. Then they turned back toward the diner. Every customer was staring directly at them. They had not moved, not in the way people should move. Their bodies had remained stiff, rigid, their limbs untouched. Yet they were facing forward now, unblinking eyes locked onto the worker. The trucker still held his spoon, but now his fingers were digging into it, bending the metal like it was made of soft wax. His mouth had started to open, jaw stretching slightly too wide, something like the echo of a word dying before it could form. The woman's head was still twisted all the way around, her neck locked in that unnatural position. The man across from her had dropped his fork. His hands were pressed against the table, fingers spreading too far, joints popping, knuckles realigning into something inhuman. And the man in the coat, his mouth had stretched even wider. The static had grown louder. And then, the figure at the counter smiled too wide. Their lips pulled back, slow and deliberate, peeling away from colorless teeth, stretching into something that wasn't a smile at all. It was a wound, a gash carved into something trying to be human. Their fingers lifted from the counter, and they started to move forward. The figure at the counter moved closer. Their steps made no sound. The worker felt the weight of unseen things pressing in, curling around their ribs, squeezing the breath from their lungs. The diner had shrunk, the walls closing in, the space warping around them. The buzzing lights above pulsed in rhythm with the hum of static leaking from the man in the coat's open mouth. The others hadn't moved, not really. They had shifted, but not in a way that made sense. The trucker's jaw had opened too wide, unhinged like something no longer human, his fingers now embedded into the countertop like roots sinking into soil. The woman in the booth remained twisted in her impossible position, her mouth stretched into something that almost resembled a scream, though no sound came out. The air felt thick, full of something unseen, something waiting. The worker had to choose. Something deep in their bones whispered the first option. Accept it. Take their place behind the counter. Resume wiping it down with the cloth that had fallen forgotten to the floor. Let the routine continue. Let the world remain still. If they did, maybe the figures would stop moving. Maybe the trucker would lower his spoon. Maybe the woman's head would snap back into place. Maybe everything would return to normal. But something deeper screamed that it wouldn't. There was no normal anymore. There was only the other choice. The workers stumbled back, hearts slamming against their ribs, legs screaming for movement. Their only escape was the back door, the kitchen, the storage room, the emergency exit leading out into whatever the world had become. The moment they moved, the diner responded. The trucker's body lurched, his neck twisting too far, vertebrae crunching as his head snapped toward them. The woman shuddered, her hands lifting from the table in stiff, jagged movements, the shape of her fingers stretching, distorting into something no longer human. The man across from her grinned, his mouth pulling back too much, revealing gums but no teeth. The man in the coat never closed his mouth, but the static changed, a sound that no longer resembled radio interference, but something trying to speak. The worker ran. Their feet pounded against the linoleum, their breath a thin, ragged thing trapped in their chest. The kitchen doors slammed open, revealing the narrow back hallway. The fluorescent lights above flickering wildly, casting sharp, jagged shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The worker shoved past the dry storage, their hands grazing against something too warm, something that felt like skin but wasn't. They didn't stop. The emergency exit loomed ahead, the red exit sign flickering, half dead. Their fingers reached for the handle. And then the whispers began. Soft at first, just behind their ears, curling into their thoughts, sliding down their spine like 100 phantom hands. Words spoken in voices they almost recognized, syllables fractured and stretched, a chorus of wrongness. It begged, "Stay, stay," and everything would be right again. Stay, and nothing would ever change. The worker's stomach twisted, their vision swimming, but their body refused to stop. Their fingers closed around the handle and yanked the door open. The night air never came. No wind, no scent of damp pavement, no open expanse of sky. The worker stumbled forward into another diner. The same vinyl booths, the same flickering neon glow, the same low hum of unseen static. The back door did not exist anymore. The moment their foot crossed the threshold, their gaze lifted to themselves, standing behind the counter, eyes wide with horror. Their own face stared back at them, mouth parted in realization, fingers clenched around a rag that had already fallen to the floor. The door slammed shut behind them, locking with a sound like a heartbeat snapping in half. The diner buzzed with familiarity. The trucker sat at the counter, stirring his coffee in slow, endless circles. The couple whispered soundlessly to each other, locked in a conversation that never ended. The man in the coat sat in his corner, mouth open, the static pulsing like a dying breath. The reflection in the glass still had its head tilted, and the clock above the door ticked forward. 3 Uhr nachts. Then it reset. 3 Uhr nachts. Again.